Joining us now, NBC News senior national security correspondent Courtney Kube. Courtney, what are the possible parts or paths Iran could take to retaliate, and what American targets does the U.S. military believe are most at risk right now?
So the biggest concern is that they will go after a U.S. military base or asset like a ship in the region. Remember, the U.S. has about 40,000, give or take, men and women, that's in uniform, and civilians throughout the Middle East. And that it includes a number of thousands of them who are out at sea on ships. Now, we have seen Iran retaliate in the past after the killing of Qasem Soleimani. Of course, Iran launching a number of ballistic missiles at a base housing Americans in western Iraq called Al-Assad. But we've also seen these proxy networks also lash out at Americans in recent years, including launching things like rockets or mortars, even drones at some of the smaller U.S. military bases, particularly in Syria, but also in Iraq. That is the biggest concern, is that they will work to somehow overwhelm the existing defenses of some of those bases. But it's not just these little ones that are at risk right now, Anna. There's also defense officials also concerned about some of the bigger bases in the region.
And you also have reporting about a potential threat here at home. Iran sending a private message to President Trump before this attack, warning that they could activate some sleeper cells on American soil. What more are you learning?
Yeah, this happened during the G7 in Canada, an intermediary passing a message from Iran directly to President Trump, warning that if he were to decide for the U.S. military to take action in Iran, that Iran could activate these sleeper cells in the United States and unleash some sort of terrorism here domestically. Now, of course, this was before President Trump decided to very quickly leave the G7 early on Monday, saying that he needed to come back to D.C. because he needed to deal with this evolving and tense situation in the Middle East, particularly in the strikes between Israel and Iran, Anna.
Okay, Courtney Kube, we know you're continuing to dig into the reporting. Thank you so much for bringing us those updates. And now I want to bring in former CIA director and senior national security and intelligence analyst for MSNBC, John Brennan. Director Brennan, Iran has said Americans in the region are all targets. We also have this new warning about Iranian sleeper cells here in the U.S. What are you most concerned about this morning?
Well, I think at this point, Iran is still trying to decide how it's going to respond, because I do believe it feels obliged to respond to the military strikes that we've conducted. And so I don't think they're going to alienate regional neighbors, such as the Gulf states, whether it be Qatar, Saudi Arabia, or the UAE. As Courtney pointed out, the U.S. naval assets in the Gulf, I think, are possible targets because they're taking place on the international waterways of the Persian Gulf. But also, Iran has tremendous capability, if they choose to exercise it, in terms of terrorism. They're the leading state sponsor of terrorism, and they do have assets and sources, basically in Europe, Africa, Middle East, Asia, and so on. And whether or not they have sources here in the United States or assets that could be used to carry out these attacks, I think is a question. And I know the FBI, DHS, and state and local officials now are looking very closely at any individuals who may be affiliated with the Iranian regime.
What is Iran's calculation in deciding what levers to pull? And what realistic capabilities do they have, given just how degraded their military is, the number of high-ranking officials who've been killed, the Ayatollah forced into hiding? By all accounts, Iran appears to be in survival mode.
Yes, and certainly their military capabilities have been depleted. They still have missile rocket capabilities that they could, in fact, use in the general area. I think inside of Iraq, there are a number of Iranian militias that continue to operate there and could target U.S. forces. But again, I think they're trying to calculate exactly what they can do that is going to be responsive to the U.S. military strikes, but without triggering even more devastating U.S. military strikes. And it is tough. And I think, as General Hertling said earlier, the Iranians, I think, see time being on their side a bit. They don't feel maybe, that it's imperative to strike immediately. They could do some things. They could have some of their proxies reach out now and carry out some strikes against U.S. diplomats or U.S. citizens. But again, I think they're going to be looking at this from the standpoint of what should they be doing over the course of the next several weeks, months, and even years.
It took about 5 days for Iran to launch the response after the killing of Soleimani back in 2020. So that's something for all of our viewers to keep in mind. U.S. officials have concluded, or at least have discussed, that they are unsure exactly what happened to those 3 nuclear facilities. We know they put a dent in Iran's enriched uranium stockpiles, according to the officials. But could Iran have moved those stockpiles, or the majority of them? How does the U.S. find out how much uranium Iran still has?
It's going to be tough to decide. I know that there was some movement in terms of vehicles at some of these facilities prior to the strikes, so they could have moved some of that highly enriched uranium outside of it. But I think it is going to be up to a variety of intelligence collection systems, whether it be human sources, technical collection, imagery, and so on. But the IAEA also will be doing some evaluation. So that bomb damage assessment is going to take some time. But I think unless we have people actually inside of these facilities, we're really not going to have a conclusive view of exactly how extensive and how thorough the damage was.
And it's still unclear how far along these programs were. I want to play some sound of what we've heard from the Trump administration about their assessment of Iran's nuclear program and its proximity to developing a nuclear weapon. Let's listen.
The IC continues to assess that Iran is not building a nuclear weapon, and Supreme Leader Khamenei has not authorized the nuclear weapons program that he suspended in 2003.
What intelligence do you have that Iran is building a nuclear weapon? Your intelligence community has said they have no evidence that they are at this point.
Well, then my intelligence community is wrong. Who in the intelligence community said that?
Your director of national intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard.
She's wrong.
What new intelligence does the U.S. have since then that the Iranians have changed their position on nuclear weapons? And does this new intelligence come from U.S. sources and methods, or are we getting this information from other countries?
Well, I would just simply say that the president's made it very clear. He's looked at all of this, all of the intelligence, all of the information, and come to the conclusion that the Iranian nuclear program is a threat.
Just how important is it to nail down this answer? Because right now it's all over the place.
Well, it was, I think, very important to nail it down prior to a U.S. decision to carry out those military strikes. But by all accounts, it's apparent that there is no new intelligence that indicates that the Iranians have moved forward with their nuclear weapons program that was suspended in 2003. And unfortunately, I think this is Bibi Netanyahu and the Israelis that convinced Trump to disregard the position of the U.S. intelligence community and to basically move forward and to try to destroy the nuclear program. But again, no indication at all that there was any imminent threat or that the Iranians were, in fact, moving forward with their plans to fabricate a nuclear warhead.
Do you think we'd be in this position now if the U.S. had not pulled out of the Iran nuclear deal in the first Trump administration?
Absolutely not, because the Fordo was prohibited from enriching uranium until 2030. And so Trump's decision to tear up that agreement and to abandon it, the Iranians were adhering to it. The United States was not. So I think the United States has had a chance to prevent this from happening. But unfortunately, I think the Trump administration has decided that to go forward with Bibi Netanyahu's plans to do as much damage as possible inside of Iran and go toward regime change.
Former CIA Director John Brennan, as always, thank you very much for offering your expertise and your insights.